Hello, today we're going to be continuing our conversation about the Cold War, and specifically, we're going to be talking about Cold War policies. At the conclusion of this presentation, you should be able to do these two things: describe the goal of the United States during the Cold War, and evaluate whether the Truman Doctrine was successful. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. These words were spoken by Winston Churchill, March 5th, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri. At the end of World War II, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West, in this case the United States, Great Britain, and France, was frosty. See what I did there? The Soviet Union wished to create a buffer zone of communist governments to protect their western border from what it viewed as conflicting interests in Western Europe. The United States did not wish to give up the power and prestige that it had enjoyed following the successful end to World War II. Both powers became suspicious of each other's motives, and a number of events between 1945 and 1949 caused the two superpowers to come into conflict. Eastern Europe became the first area of disagreement. The Western nations believed that Eastern European nations should freely determine their own governments. Stalin feared these nations would become anti-communist if given the opportunity, so he did all that he could to ensure that the Soviet influence would remain strong with a continued military presence. Greece became another area of contention. A civil war developed between the communist and anti-communist forces. This in turn led to the development of the Truman Doctrine, which ensured that the United States would provide money and aid to countries fighting against the communist influence. This doctrine came out of the fear that if one nation fell to communism, other countries could fall as well as an effect. This was known as the domino theory. A dude named Dean Acheson, who in the future will be Secretary of the State, likened the situation to a barrel of apples infected with disease, and said that Greece falling to communism may lead to communist takeovers in places like Iran, Africa, Italy, or even France. So, to further disrupt the Soviet influence, the United States came up with what we called the Marshall Plan, named after the current Secretary of State, George Marshall. The Marshall Plan set aside $13 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars to rebuild war-torn Europe. The Soviet Union was not excluded from the plan, but the speculation was that they would refuse to participate. And refuse to participate they did. The Soviet Union and their satellite states, which were countries that were under their influence and controlled by them indirectly, did refuse to participate. They claimed that this was little more than an attempt to make those countries economically dependent on the United States. And they're not entirely wrong. The idea was if we offered them money to rebuild them, they would become dependent on us, and because they were dependent on us, they wouldn't have to turn to communism as kind of a solution to that problem. By 1947, the United States had developed a policy of containment that sought to prevent communism from expanding beyond the present borders. Checking for understanding. What was the United States' goal during the Cold War? What policies supported this goal? And How successful was the Truman Doctrine in supporting this goal?